Hi everybody! In this video, we're going to be going through the notes for lesson 2.4. And in this lesson, we are going to learn how to graph lines. Now that we know what a slope is, we're going to be using our slope to make the graph of a line. And today we're going to focus on a specific style of equation that is called slope-intercept form. The first thing you need to know about these equations is that every equation is going to have an x and a y. And really specifically here, the y is always alone when we are looking at slope-intercept form. If you ever see an equation where the y is not alone, then it is not slope-intercept form, and we cannot use today's strategy to make that graph. In this equation, the x is also literally going to be an x. There's going to be a letter x, but there are also going to be two numbers in the equation. So what we're going to talk about now is what those numbers mean and how they help us make a graph. Let's start by talking about what the m means. In this equation, the m is the slope, which means it's going to tell us the rise and the run that we should use when we make our graph. The other thing we should know about m is that it is always before the x. So if you look at the x, you're going to look at the number that's right before that, and that's always going to be your m. The last thing that you need to know is that it is not always the first number in the equation. The x could be at the beginning of the equation, or it could be at the end of the equation. The important thing is that the m is always the number that is right before the x, the coefficient. The second number in this equation is the b. In this equation, the b tells us the y-intercept, which is going to be the place on the graph where the line crosses the y-axis of the graph. So it's going to tell us a point where we can start our graph on the y-axis. The other thing that you need to know is that the y-intercept will always be a point where the first number is 0 and the second number is the number from the equation. The last thing you need to know is that this is not always the last number in the equation. We can write this equation in different orders of terms. We just have to look for the number that is not attached to the x, because the m is the number that's attached to the x. Let's practice looking at some equations and identifying the slope and the y-intercept. So when we look at this equation, we're going to start by looking for the mx part of the equation, because the m tells us the slope. In this equation, the mx part is the second part of the equation, the second term, because the x is at the end. Now, the invisible number here that's right before the x is a -1. So my slope is going to be -1. And because I want this to be a rise and a run, I'm going to make that into a fraction by putting a 1 on the bottom. Then I'm going to look for the b part of the equation. Now, the b is the number that doesn't have an x. In this case, it's the first number. So my y-intercept will be 0, whatever that b number was, which is 3. Let's try that again. In the next equation, I'm going to start by looking for the slope. So I'm going to find the x, and in my brain, I'm going to go mx. Now that happens to be the first term of this equation, and the m would be 2/7. Then I'm going to look for the b. The b is the other number that doesn't have an x. So I'm going to write 0, comma, whatever the b was, which in this problem was -1. Let's try that again. In the next example, I'm going to look for the x, which happens to be the second term. So the mx part of the equation is the second term. That means that the m is 5. And I'm going to write 5 over 1 so that I remind myself that it's a rise and it's a run. The b part of the equation is the number that doesn't have an x. So I'm going to write my point 0, comma, whatever the b number was, which is 2/3. Now the last example is a little tricky. Again, I'm going to look for my mx, and I do see my x here. The invisible number that's before the x is a 1. So my slope is going to be 1 over 1 because I want to make it look like a fraction. But there is no number in this equation for a b. So the number that I'm going to fill in, which means there's nothing here, is 0. My y-intercept will be 0, comma, and then there's nothing there, so 0. The last thing we're going to talk about today is what do we do with this information once we find the key features? So first thing we're going to do every time we see an equation is we're going to make a list of the slope, which is the m, and the y-intercept, which is the b. When I look at this equation, the x term is first. So my m will be -5 over 1. And the b term, which does not have an x, is last. So I would write 0, comma, 3. I'm going to begin my graph at the y-intercept. So I'm going to start here. And on the graph, I'm going to find the point 0, comma, 3, which is always going to be on the y-axis because it's a y-intercept. In this graph, it happens to be right there. Then I'm going to use my slope to move to the next point. My rise is -5 and my run is 1. So I'm going to go down 5 and right 1. From the 3, I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down. I'm going to go right 1 and put a new point there. Now I don't have room to do that again. If I count, I only have 4 more spaces, so there's not enough room to graph another point on this graph. Instead, I'm going to grab my edge of my ID or the edge of a piece of paper, and I'm going to draw a nice straight line through these 2 points. Let's try that one more time. So again, my first step is to identify my key features. So I'm going to identify my slope, which is my m, and my y-intercept, which is my b. In this equation, the mx part happens to be the second term. So my m will be 3 over 2. And the y-intercept is the first term. So my point will be 0, comma, 4. Now the y-intercept tells me where to start, and I should always have a point somewhere on the y-axis. So on the y-axis, my starting point is going to be 0, comma, 4. Then my slope tells me to rise 3 and run 2. If I try to do that, I notice I don't have enough room to go up 3 spaces. So I'm going to need to reverse my slope, which means I'm going to go down 3 and left 2. 1, 2, 3, left 2, put a point. 1, 2, 3, left 2, put a point. 1, 2, 3, left 2, put a point. Now I'm going to draw a nice straight line through my points. And I'm done with this problem. Thank you all so much for watching. Please start your practice.